My name is Connie McIntyre. I am a co-founder and executive director of the Granny Annie, and I'm really pleased to be here with you today. Celebrating family stories, one of my favorite things to do. The presentation this afternoon is presented in collaboration with the Missouri History Museum, and we are so grateful to be in this beautiful space together today, and also we are thankful for all the help the museum has provided for organization and technical support. You'll see the benefits of that as the day goes on. The Granny Annie is a nonprofit organization. We're a group of volunteers, and we were established here in St. Louis, Missouri 13 years ago. Every year for the past 13 years, the Granny Annie has invited young people everywhere in grades 4 through 8 to interview an older relative, learn something interesting from their family's history, and capture that story in their very best writing. It's an exciting project that we continue to be excited about year after year, because this past year, almost 1,000 young people had a Granny Annie experience. And that means about 1,000 families had a Granny Annie experience. This is the true heart of what our mission is, the connection that can deepen within families as stories are shared from their history, and then also the connections that can grow in the greater community as some of those stories are shared beyond the family itself. So this past year, the Granny Annie received 602 submissions. That's stories and art. It was a wonderful February for our volunteers to read all those wonderful stories, and then when the art came in, to enjoy every piece of art that was submitted. So from those 602 submissions, 47 pieces were published. So yes, it was quite an honor for our young people who are here today who are published to be chosen out of all of those submissions. And you will see why as the afternoon goes on, you'll see why these particular stories and pieces of art were chosen. They so beautifully represent all that has happened this year for those 1,000 families and students. I know you want to get right onto the program. I just invite you to sit back and be comfortable and enjoy yourselves. I predict that you're going to be educated a little bit today and definitely entertained. And I'm pretty sure you're going to be touched somewhere quite deeply today by some of our stories. And maybe you'll be inspired. And I hope you are. I hope you're inspired to share that story that you know from your family's history, or to find out about that story that you heard a little bit about, but you don't really know as much as you want to know. So I hope all of those things happen for you. I'm going to turn this over to Fran Hamilton. Fran is the Associate Director of the Granny Annie, and she's going to introduce a few key people. Thank you.
We have a special guest. As Connie mentioned, the heart of the Granny Annie involves discovering, writing, preserving, and sharing family stories. This strengthens family bonds and community bonds and increases young people's sense of their own identity. And we're very pleased to have and recognize one of those students today who had a Granny Annie experience. He's here from Scotia, Nebraska, quite a long journey. And what was the title of the story you wrote?
The 5,000-mile journey.
Farther than from Scotia, right? A 5,000-mile journey. Now, where did that journey start and where did it end?
It started in Lithuania and ended in the United States.
That's a long journey. How long did it take?
It started in 1943 and ended in 1950.
Wow, 7 years. I'll bet there were a lot of amazing family stories that happened during those 7 years. And now we're going to hear some amazing family stories from the authors that are here today. And I will now turn things over to Martha. Thank you.
The name of the story is Bloody Hill. My name is Olivina Ray. Most people call me Olivia, and I am 6 years old. I was not frightened by the Civil War at all, but after the battle on Bloody Hill, my mind changed. One day, I was playing with my 6 siblings on the porch, and suddenly a soldier marched up the yard and shouted at me, "Get the heck inside. There's going to be a battle and we're taking over your land," he barked with an accent. More soldiers were behind him, preparing for the battle of their lives. Most of the children scrambled into the cellar, but I managed to stay up with the adults and all of the chaos. The house was crowded enough when there weren't soldiers around, but now they turned our humble home into a medical center, with soldiers crawling around every inch. I got to see the battle from our front porch while sitting on my grandpa's favorite rocking chair. I saw movement in the corn, but I failed to tell anyone. The soldier that yelled at me before found me and my grandpa and escorted us into the cellar door and pushed us hard into safety. It was loud outside because of the gunfire, cannons, and men wailing. But in the cellar, those noises were amplified. I couldn't sleep or think. It looked like my grandpa couldn't either. We had enough. When all was quiet, my grandpa slowly climbed up the ladder, opened the hatch, first one foot, then the other. He swiftly stepped out. Kapow! A cannonball struck the ground, barely missing his feet. The force was so strong, he slid down the ladder, hitting every rung on the way, and bruised his head. That was the end of curiosity for him. When my family finally came up the cellar, 5 days later, most of our crops were trampled. There was blood. There were dead and injured soldiers everywhere. It was the worst sight I ever saw in my life. I slid down the slippery hill towards the corn and saw someone alive. It was General Nathaniel Lyon. My family hauled a wagon down to him, and soldiers wheeled him to our house, and that's where he stayed until he passed away later that night. The Battle of Wilson Creek, also known as the Battle of Oak Hills, was fought near Springfield, Missouri on August 10th, 1861. This is the story of my great-great-great Aunt Olivia Ray, who saw the battle with her own eyes. My family would later sell this property to the government for the greater good.
Lucky on the Lusitania. 1914 off the southern coast of Ireland. 1915 Washington, D.C., United States of America. On May 8, 1915, my great-great-grandmother, Laura Powell, despaired when she sat down to drink her steaming morning tea and read the Washington Post headline, "Steamer Lusitania torpedoed and sunk off Irish coast." 7 months earlier, on October 3, 1914, Laura Powell had boarded that same ship near her birthplace in Liverpool, England, to make the week-long transatlantic journey to New York to be with her soon-to-wed fiancé, Arthur. World War I had begun 2 months earlier, and German U-boats had just started to patrol the treacherous water around England. Laura surely didn't know what was to come on her voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. Not long after her journey began, Captain Daniel Dow made a terrifying statement over the ship's loudspeaker while Laura was getting dressed. There was, in fact, a German submarine chasing them. All of the passengers, including Laura, were petrified. Immediately, everyone started to cover the portholes with cloth so that it would be more difficult for the submarine to determine the ship's exact location. When it came time for dinner, all of the fine china was gone. The crew had stored it away so that passengers wouldn't accidentally drop something and make a horrific sound. All of the cooking supplies were put away, so passengers had to eat sandwiches and colder fare off of paper plates. On the way back to their staterooms, the men, women, and children all had to walk very quietly as if they were mice, because the captain didn't want the German submarine to hear them. Eventually, on October 9th, 1914, the Lusitania safely reached the American shoreline at Ellis Island near New York City. My great-grandmother was greeted by her family, and they went home to Washington, D.C. They were all devastated just a few months later to learn that the Lusitania had been sunk by a German torpedo. Several family members had sailed on the Lusitania over the years as they traveled between their homeland of England and the United States. The passengers and crew of the Lusitania had almost made it back to England on the voyage. The ship was sunk off the coast of Ireland just before reaching her final destination of Liverpool. Maybe the torpedo had been fired from the same German submarine that had been following the Lusitania when my great-great-grandmother was aboard. Approximately 1,198 people died on that fateful day in May. It was then that my great-great-grandmother realized that her voyage on the Lusitania had been a lucky one.
The Backyard Coaster. It was the summer of 1938, and my grandma Patricia was one of 8 siblings. She had 6 brothers and 1 sister. She was the youngest girl in the family. Her brothers were always getting into trouble and pulling jokes on each other. The last trick they pulled led to a close call. One day, my grandma's brothers made a goal to find trouble. As they were walking home, they found an open dump where they stumbled across an old conveyor rail, wheels, and other pieces. They all knew this was going to be fun and had a plan of what to do with the rails. In the backyard of their home was the steepest, meanest hill you would ever see. The brothers smiled a mischievous smile. They began to build their coaster. At the top of the hill, they pieced the rails together like a track going down the hill. They dashed to the garage to get the wagon they had built from the rusty spare parts, and they placed it on the track. It fit. Now they were ready. The oldest boy, Joseph, asked proudly, "Who's going to try it?" Everyone was smart enough not to try anything the boys had made. No one said anything. The only one who had no clue what was going on was the 3rd youngest boy, Bernard. Joseph snatched Bernard and convinced him to ride the wagon. The old Bernard grinned. He liked the idea of being the bravest and knew he would now be included in the group. So he agreed to ride. He plopped himself into the raggedy cart, smiling the biggest smile in the world. He wiggled and jumped in the cart. Joseph stepped back and gave the cart a big push. The old rusty cart gave away. It rolled vigorously down the steep hill. As it got faster and faster, Bernard finally understood why no one else wanted to ride the wagon. He felt a small bump, and before he could snap, he was in the middle of a busy street. With his hands sweating, his heart pounding, and his face red, he screamed in rage and fear. He had trusted his siblings' coaster when he really shouldn't have. The cart zoomed by loud cars that were honking at him. He could hear muffled voices in the background, and everything seemed to slow down for a second. A loud honk rang in his ear and broke the silence. There was another bump, but this time it was much larger than the earlier bump. This one was enough to launch him, and that's just what happened. Paralyzed by terror, he flew up in the air, but somehow stayed in the cart, which the cart hit the hard cement bricks of the house across the street. My grandma's father stepped out to see Bernard, scratched and bruised, walking up the hill with his wagon. Since Bernard wasn't really injured, his parents were more worried than angry. You can still see the chip in the house to this day, and the siblings got in some trouble for their antics. They all learned to think before acting.
Love at First Sight. This story took place in 1939 in Heron, Illinois, and in St. Louis, Missouri. Angelina and Pauline had been friends since childhood. One day, Angelina, who had moved to Illinois, decided to visit her friend, Pauline, in St. Louis. Richard, Angelina's nephew, drove her more than 100 miles to see her best friend, for she could not drive. Rich saw Pauline's daughter, Josephine, and fell in love at first sight. When Rich got home, he decided to send Josephine a gift without consulting anyone about the proper etiquette. Rich chose a very expensive brush, mirror, and comb set. In St. Louis, Josephine received her gift in the mail and got in huge trouble. Back then, boys did not send gifts to girls, and it was frowned upon. The following day, Pauline, beside herself with confusion, called Angelina to set a date to figure things out. Angelina hastily called Rich to see if he could come over. Unbeknownst to him, he was in for a long and very loud lecture over the proper behavior for young men. Rich and Angelina again drove 2 hours to St. Louis to see Pauline and her daughter to make things right. Angelina and Pauline interrogated Rich and Josephine with questions of, "What did you do?" and "Why did you do it?" filling the air with loud voices. Rich explained that he only sent the extravagant gift because he wanted to show Josephine that he liked her. Angelina and Pauline laughed, thinking how incredible this was, for the two young people had never been alone and had barely talked. Finally, after Josephine and Rich begged them, Pauline and Angelina set the ground rules for the young people's first date. They decided to go to the movies. Smushed in the car, shoulder to shoulder, Rich, Josephine, Angelina, Pauline, both of their husbands, Josephine's grandma, her two sisters, brother, aunt, and uncle, all accompanied them as chaperones to the movies. Rich bought popcorn for Josephine, and not wanting to be rude, emptied his wallet and got it for everyone. Everyone walked into the theater, politely asking a few people to leave their seats for the large group who took up an entire row. Entering the now empty row, Rich went first, followed by everyone but Josephine, going last. Sitting on opposite ends of the row, they awkwardly leaned back as the movie began. A few months later, my great-grandparents, Rich and Josephine, were married. They had known each other for only a short time, but they knew that they would be together forever. Rich and Josephine were married for 55 years until Josephine passed away in March 1994. They had 3 children, their 2 boys being my grandpa and Uncle Joe, and their 1 girl being my Aunt Amalia. Rich's gift to Josephine continues to travel throughout my family, going from generation to generation. That brush, mirror, and comb set usually sits on my sister's dresser, but I brought it here today. This is a treasured family heirloom that my sister and I look forward to passing along to our children.
A single ring. 1939, Sokol, Galicia, Poland. It was 1939, and much of Europe had entered World War II, which included the Holocaust. The Germans, having taken control of parts of Northern Europe, rounded up Jews from Poland, Germany, and surrounding areas. The Germans took the Jews to concentration camps, death camps, or gas chambers. My great-grandmother, Hannah Streichel, was forcefully taken on a train to a concentration camp. Teenager Hannah and her parents, Sarah and Aryeh, herded onto a cramped cattle cart train, were headed to a concentration camp. Her mother spotted a crack in the train floorboards. The cattle car slowed as it rounded the bend on the track, and Hannah's parents begged her to squeeze through the crack so she could escape. It was risky and dangerous. If she were spotted in an attempt to escape, she would surely be killed. Scared and unwilling to part from her parents, she cried, "No, I won't leave you." Her parents knew this was her only chance for survival. In an act of pure selflessness, Hannah's mother pushed her through the crack in the floorboard, saving her life at the expense of their own. Having been squeezed through the floorboards, Hannah was released from the train. The tracks were raised on a platform, and as she was freed, she tumbled down a gully. As the train straightened out on its path, it picked up speed. Hannah ran into a nearby forest and hid amongst the trees for 2 weeks, surviving on rainwater and berries. While in the woods, Hannah found a ring engraved with the initials MK. Having no physical possessions left to her name, she kept the ring and placed it safely in the pocket of her dress. 2 weeks seemed like a lifetime to a scared and cold Hannah. After wandering in the dark, cold woods, searching for suitable hiding places and food to survive, Hannah found a convent tucked away deep in the woods. Seeking shelter at the convent, Hannah explained she was a war refugee. Hannah pleaded with the nuns to allow her to seek shelter with them in exchange for cleaning the convent. Nazi troops, who were searching for hidden Jews, came to the convent, accusing Hannah of being a Jew. "No, I'm not," she fearfully answered. The Nazi officer accused her of lying and backhanded her, knocking a tooth out. She reached into her pocket, taking out the ring she'd found earlier in the woods. "My name is Maria Costas," she trembled, explaining that Maria is a Catholic name. Believing her, the Nazi officer let her be. "I am thankful for that ring that saved my great-grandmother's life, for it is because of that ring that I'm here today. Sometimes a little ring can make a big difference."
A personal situation. Have you ever gotten to a position that got personal fast? My great-grandpa happened to get into just such a personal situation. It was December 7, 1941, and my great-grandpa was 13. He had a school play, but before the play started, my great-grandpa decided to go to the outhouse. This trip to the outhouse is going to be like no other. As my great-grandpa walked up the stairs, he noticed a man great-grandpa thought he had never seen before. The man was average height with his shoulders bent down, his hands on his head, and his back slouched down. When my great-grandpa got all the way up the stairs, he could tell this man was his school bus driver. My great-grandpa saw a tear in his bus driver's eye. This made my great-grandpa's hands sweaty and butterflies dance in his stomach. Great-grandpa was uncomfortable because he was used to seeing his bus driver happy. My great-grandpa had never seen a man cry before in his 13 years. The bus driver had 12 kids, 10 boys and 2 girls, and all 10 boys are in the service. My great-grandpa asked the bus driver what was wrong. The bus driver told my great-grandpa that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese earlier that day. Standing in awe, my great-grandpa asked why the bus driver was so upset. The bus driver said 2 of his sons were in Pearl Harbor, and he didn't know if his 2 sons were alive. With abundant tears streaming down his face, the bus driver asked my great-grandpa not to tell anyone. My great-grandpa promised. The next morning on the way to school, my great-grandpa ran down the aisle of the bus to ask the bus driver if his sons were okay. The bus driver said that earlier that morning he had received a call from the Army. The Army said both sons were alive and uninjured. My great-grandpa was delighted with this great news. The whole day after that, my great-grandpa couldn't stop thinking about the bus driver, his sons, and Pearl Harbor.
The Flying Messengers of World War II. This story takes place in 1942 in 8 countries in Europe, including England, Ireland, and France. At the age of 12, young Richard Cassock came home from church and found a pigeon with a broken wing. His father cut a hole in the top of a chicken coop and placed a box in the coop with the pigeon inside of it. In no time, other pigeons came around because Richard offered food and shelter for the wandering birds. He fed them and cared for them for several years. Caring for the pigeons became his hobby and filled much spare time. When he got drafted into the U.S. Army, Richard was told he would be a radio operator. But he had to take a test to see what he was best at. He was really good at marksmanship, but marksmen were most likely to die than other people. So he purposely did poorly at the marksmanship test so he wouldn't have to be a marksman. The Army decided he was best at carpentry, and he had to do that for a while. He drove trucks and built outhouses for all the new places. Richard learned somehow that the U.S. Army Air Corps was creating an experimental unit of 125 men who had experience with pigeons. At first he thought it was a joke, but he was intrigued. So he signed up for this project. He had to go to training first. Then he had to learn how to teach the pigeons to remember a path and deliver messages from one site to another. There was an 18 by 18 foot platform with the hole in the middle that held feed and water. The men set the pigeons in the middle and let them loose. When the pigeons were hungry, they would return to eat. Every 3 or 4 days, the men would move the platform, beginning with 3 feet, then 100 feet, followed by half a mile, and eventually 18 miles or more. At some point, a second platform with feed and water was introduced so that the pigeons would learn to fly to more than one place. After the pigeons were trained, they were taken to the front lines. From there, they carried capsules on their legs with messages in code, saying the soldiers needed supplies or other help. Richard's unit, called the 277th Signal Pigeon Company, would pass the messages along to people who would get soldiers the supplies or other help that they needed. My great-grandpa Richard Kasich says he didn't do much in the war, even though he helped send important messages that helped save many lives and win battles.
The Man in Stripes, 1940s, Germany. In the 1940s, during World War II, my great-grandfather Zadie, who was 21 years old at the time, was torn apart from his family. He ended up in a concentration camp in Germany. He didn't know where his family members were, what they were doing, or if they were even alive. He felt devastated, miserable, and all alone. Zadie and his fellow inmates were given the job of cleaning up after Allied bomb attacks on the trains. The Germans didn't give them any food, since they were expected to scavenge the ruins and find food for themselves. This was a dangerous and tough job, but also partially rewarding, because Zadie and his friends actually got to see how the Allies were destroying the Germans' trains and tracks. One sunny day, Zadie was cleaning up with the rest of his group, when all of a sudden he saw hundreds of bomber planes, and every 50 feet or so, the Allies were dropping a row of many bombs at a time, and they were inching closer and closer to him and his friends. Zadie was starting to get really scared and nervous, when suddenly he came up with a plan. Instead of trying to outrun the planes like most would do, especially when they're panicking, he told his friends to run in the direction opposite of the way the planes were headed. This way, they would be in an area where the bombs had already been exploded. Unfortunately, some of his friends didn't listen to his idea, and sadly, they ended up dying. But the ones that listened to him survived. After the bombs were dropped and exploded, the Allies took out machine guns and tried to kill the rest of the people that didn't die. One plane was specifically going after my great-grandpa. Zadie quickly hid in a bomb crater, but then noticed that the plane could shoot him from the other side. He was petrified and frightened, yet knew that he had tried his best. When the plane flew closer, the pilot must have seen Zadie's striped clothes and realized he was a prisoner. And the last second, the plane turned away, and Zadie couldn't believe his eyes. The moral of the story is that even in your absolute worst moments, don't panic and give up all of your hope. If not for my great-grandpa's courage and bravery, I wouldn't be here to tell this story today.
Let us not forget 1945 between Buchenwald concentration camp in southern Poland. My great-grandpa Fred Slun was a prisoner during World War II because he was Jewish. At the beginning of the war, he was just 17. He was put in a concentration camp, and his entire family was murdered by the Nazis. He endured a forced march between camps, where all he had to eat was raw potatoes that he dug up with his own hands, and he had to squeeze rainwater out of his hat so he could drink. He survived living in a concentration camp with very harsh conditions. Toward the end of the war, when my great-grandfather was about 20, he was put on a train in a cattle car with the other surviving Jews from his death camp. One of his good friends, Joe, was with him on the train. The Nazis were moving the prisoners away from the front lines because they were trying to hide them from the Americans. After a while, the train stopped, and the doors of the train were opened. The Nazi announced to the prisoners that they were free to leave if they wanted. Many people started to run into the nearby woods and fields to be free. But my great-grandpa did not trust the Nazis and did not move a muscle. Joe was about to run out of the train with the others when Fred held him back by the arm and pleaded, "Don't go, it's a trick." Thankfully, Joe considered my great-grandpa's request because a few seconds later, the Nazis opened fire with machine guns and killed all the people who had run from the train. My great-grandpa saved his best friend's life that day and his own. The boys hugged as the Nazis closed the doors of the train and continued down to another camp, where Joe and Fred lived out the remainder of the war in horribly harsh conditions. When the war was over, both Joe and Fred had survived and were liberated by the Americans. They remained the closest of friends for the rest of their lives. It is my job as a descendant of the Holocaust survivors to tell this story for generations to come, so tragedies like this won't happen again. Let us not forget.
To live, Jerusalem, Israel. 1948, Jerusalem, Israel. On May 14th, 1948, Nachman Ofer was spiritedly cheering and dancing in the streets with the rest of his Jerusalem neighbors and family. He was 7 years old, and Israel had just officially become a state. Nachman had 2 older sisters and an older brother named Yitzchak. His mother, Chava, was pregnant with a baby boy, and his grandfather lived in an apartment across the street. Nachman had a very sharp memory and was in a school for the gifted children. As he waved his new Israeli flag, Nachman could not imagine any place he'd rather be. In 1934, Nachman's father, Ephraim Dov, had moved from Lublin, Poland, to the land that would become Israel. His father's brothers, who were still in Poland, had been killed in the Holocaust. Nachman's father had been a construction worker and traveled all over Israel building houses. After Israel became a state, Nachman saw his father less and less frequently. The neighboring Arab countries had attacked, and his father was busy building trenches and fortifications to be safe from the Arab snipers. On the morning of June 11th, 1948, Nachman and his father and his family were relieved to hear that there was a ceasefire between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Their home had been hit hard by a shelling, and they already had to move homes once. Nachman left with his father and brother Yitzchak to go to synagogue while things were still calm. Just then, they heard a deafening boom, and his father, Ephraim Dov, had collapsed. Yitzchak shouted at Nachman, "Take mother inside," because she had fainted in shock. As Nachman dragged his mother indoors, he heard more shelling outside. His heart was pounding like a hammer. His neighborhood was destroyed. He ran back outside to check on his father. His neighborhood was destroyed, and his grandfather was injured, and his brother was standing over his father's dead body. His father had been killed instantly. Life changed very quickly for Nachman. His mother gave birth to a baby boy and named him after her husband, Ephraim Dov. She couldn't afford to keep all her children, so she sent Yitzchak and Nachman to live in an orphanage. There were many crying, traumatized children living there, so Nachman never got much sleep. He was not fed well either, so he and Yitzchak scavenged food from grocery trucks. Nachman had to leave school and lost almost 3 years of education. During that time, his mother, Chava, opened up a grocery store and finally earned enough money for Nachman and Yitzchak to come home. Today, Nachman Ofer, my great-grandfather, lives in New York. He and his wife Rachel have 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren. Nachman learned early on that one day you could have everything you ever want, and the next day it could all be taken from you. He tries to live every day as if it is his last.
Importance of rainwater. The story took place in 1951 in Humnoke, Arkansas. Have you ever wondered how guilt changes life? Here's an example. My grandpa, Pap as we call him, was about 5 years old when the story took place. Pap was with his 7-year-old cousin, Tommy. They were making a road in the dirt driveway, using rocks to line the roadway and empty bottles for their cars. Then some hens came with their chicks and scratched up the newly built road. The boys were furious, so they put the chicks in a 5-gallon bucket and moved them to the shady backyard. The boys worked hard and rebuilt the road. Just as they started playing with the bottle cars, the chicks returned and scratched up the road, obliterating the boys' roadway yet again. The boys were explosively angry. They gathered the chicks and once again took them to the backyard. This time the boys decided to not take any more risks of having their roadway destroyed. They chose to once and for all fix their problem. They smashed the heads of the chicks with bricks and got rid of them for good by dumping the little chick bodies in a barrel for rainwater. The boys returned to play and rebuilt their roadway just the way they like it. Tommy's mom, Florency, came home from picking blackberries and found the dead chick bodies in her rainwater. The boys wisely sensed Florency's anger and hid under the house. Florency called for them, but they did not respond, so she baked a blackberry cobbler in order to lure them out of hiding. The boys smelled the cobbler and decided Florency must not really care about the chicks, and they came up to eat. Once they went into the kitchen, they quickly realized that this was a bad decision. Between them and the door stood Aunt Florency with a leather belt. After their punishment, Florency fed the boys some cobbler and listened to their side of the story. She then explained that she was more upset about the rainwater being ruined than the death of all the chicks. Rainwater was important for many things around the house. The guilt the boys carried from this event changed their lives. Tommy became a preacher and baptized people instead of chickens. My pap chose to raise chickens as pets and watered them with rainwater that he collected in a 5-gallon bucket.
Help. 1951, Greeley, Nebraska. My great-grandmother was a very strong woman, and I wish I could have met her. This story is told by my great-aunt Jean, who is now 75 years old and can still tell this story full details and from her heart. It was a cold Friday evening in November 1951. I was looking at a Christmas catalog in the dining room while my little brother Mick was playing with his trucks under the kitchen table. As usual, my mother was in the kitchen putting away supper, and my father was sitting in his chair reading the weekly newspaper. My sister Mary was sitting on the couch looking at the fireplace when we heard the kitchen door slam open. Bang! I heard a gunshot, my mother's scream, and a crash from a fallen glass milk container. My father and I scrambled to our feet and ran into the kitchen. Standing in the doorway was a man I didn't know, but I knew he lived close by. I had seen him a few times. He had shot my mother in the shoulder. My father yelled at me to run to the closest neighbor's house. I went through the alfalfa field next to our house. Since we went to school that way, I was familiar enough with the field to go through it in the dark. Next, I crossed the train tracks, then the country road to the neighbor's yard. The neighbors weren't there, so I opened the door, turned on a light, and called the party line, hoping my aunt would answer the phone. Hello, my aunt said. I was happy to hear her voice. I told my aunt what happened, that I was terrified, and where I was. My aunt just told me to keep calm, stay in that house, until I could hear the ambulance and police next door. I was okay with that. I turned the lights back off and sat in the dark in the old house, scared and worried for a while. Soon, I heard an ambulance and the police and felt a little better knowing there was help coming. I started back home, still a little scared, but who wouldn't be? When I was almost home, my father met me halfway through the alfalfa field and said, "Hurry up, we have to go to Grand Island with your mother." I ran back with him. My mother was in the hospital for several months. When my mother was finally allowed to come home, she was given a ball to squeeze to get some of her strength back in her arm. But she didn't use it. Instead of squeezing the ball, my mother decided to peel apples to get some of her strength back. My mother was one tough woman. The man who had shot my mother was in a mental hospital for a while. After the incident, we got a phone since we didn't have one before, but we barely used the phone again.
a wrong turn. Getting lost can be a frightening thing, but when you happen to meet something even more frightening on the way is when things start to get really scary. In the summer of 1955, my grandma, Phyllis, was 8 years old. She lived in southern Illinois in a small town called Marion. One time, her mom had to visit a friend in Chicago, and she needed someone to watch Phyllis while she was gone, since Phyllis's dad worked. Phyllis ended up staying with her Aunt Christine and her husband. They lived in the rural country with their 4 children. The front of Aunt Christine's house faced a road. The other sides of the house overlooked acres and acres of cornfields. One sunny morning, Phyllis and her cousins decided to play in the fields. They strolled out the back door and into the corn. The 5 lively kids looked and looked until eventually they discovered a bare spot where they plopped themselves down to play. After a little while, they wanted some old pots and pans to play with. Phyllis volunteered to go back to the house to fetch them. She couldn't see over the tall green stalks, and she crossed row after row until she figured that she had somehow passed the house. She was as scared and lost as could be. "I'll never get out," she thought to herself while crying. She finally decided to follow one row all the way, because this would have to lead her somewhere eventually. She started running. Aunt Christine had a neighbor far down the road to the right who happened to keep a very large bull in their pasture. Well, Phyllis ran and ran until she came face to face with this bull. His fur was brown and white and matted all over. Huge horns grew from the top of his head, and from his nose hung a big golden ring. "Humph," the bull puffed. Phyllis felt his hot breath against her face. The bull stood motionless in a pen at the time, but his head hung over. Phyllis was completely terrified. She pondered to herself, "If this bull is to the right of the house, then if I turn around and continue on, I'll eventually come to Aunt Christine's house." She took off and ran as fast and as far away from that bull as possible. After what seemed like half a day of sprinting, Phyllis burst out on the right side of Aunt Christine's house. She was extremely overjoyed to finally be back again. But everyone else was standing there looking so distraught. They had been searching high and low, but no one could find her, and here she was. When looking back now, Phyllis laughs, though she admits the experience seemed horrible at the time. She definitely learned something, and, though silly, the lesson is important. Don't ever go into acres of cornfields when the corn is way over your head, and especially when you're only an 8-year-old girl.
So I chose to illustrate the story Pocket Alarm because the transistor radio was the radio that helped our main character in the story find out that the president had just gotten shot. It was a very important object to him at the time, and it shows that small things mean a lot to most people. And I wanted to show this. The radio was a big part of his life and very simple. This was one of my favorite stories to read because it showed that technology in the not really old days, but before us, they didn't have as much technology as we did, and this is kind of what they had, and I wanted to show that, and I'm very curious of what it would be like without what we have. Thank you.
Dogs are odd. Some love the car, and some get sick just seeing it. No matter what dog, they all hate one thing: being alone. It was spring in 1966 on Vandenberg Air Force Base. Lucius and Jenny Draper, my grandparents, had bought a camper trailer for their trip to Massachusetts that summer. They wanted to test the camper, so they planned to go on a weekend camping trip with their 3 kids and their 2 dogs. With some hassle, Jenny and Lucius herded almost 3-year-old Sandra, 5.5-year-old David, and 8-year-old Bruce into their sedan. Sammy, their 25-pound, mostly black mutt, would travel in the camper. Feller, their 4-month-old, not quite trustworthy puppy, would ride in the car. They started driving down the road. After about an hour, they checked on Sammy, who was fast asleep. Bruce, David, and Sandra, who were antsy from being in the car, woke Sammy up, which proved to be an awful mistake. After ensuring Sammy was comfortable, the Drapers got back in the car and started driving away again. Sammy saw his people in his car driving away. He wanted to go too. He scratched at the curtains. He wanted to catch his people. He scratched harder at the door. It opened, swinging in the breeze. Sammy jumped. In the car, everything was going smoothly. They were almost at the crest of a hill on a 2-lane road. A couple passed them. On a 2-lane road, this is a crazy time to pass because a car could come over the hill and bam, there would be an accident. The lady in the car yelled out her window as they drove by, "Your dog fell out of the trailer!" Jenny pressed the brakes after confirming with Lucius that the lady had really said their dog fell out of the camper. Jenny swerved onto the side of the road and Lucius got out of the car. The camper door was shut, but the camper was empty. Lucius disappeared into the dust. 10 suspenseful minutes later, he came back, clutching Sammy to his chest. Sammy's paws were scraped, his nose was pink and bleeding badly, and he was missing a couple of teeth. Lucius and Sammy got back in the car, with everyone rejoicing that Sammy was alive. The family drove to the vet to fix up their beloved pet. Sammy's scrapes and nose healed. He made many more trips with his family in the camper, but he never went inside the trailer until his people were already inside, and he was never the last to leave. Did Sammy jump because he thought he was being left behind? Maybe he was simply lonely. Whatever the reason, my family is grateful for the lady who risked her life to tell them Sammy was gone. Without her, Sammy could have died on the road or starved to death. If it is possible, help others.
When drawing Sammy, I drew him with a happy expression standing in front of the camper wheel. I imagined how happy he was, about to go on a road trip with his family. To make him stand out, I pressed extra hard with pencil and blended, also making sure to show light on his coat. When drawing this piece, I tackled the challenge of having to shade a dark animal. This was one of the most challenging pieces I submitted to the Granny Annie. I chose this story because I love pets and animals inspire me to draw. I thought it would be fun to draw Sammy and try and imagine what he looked like.
After Granny Annie, Volume 13 went to press, my father realized a few events from the story had become blended in his mind. He believes this edited version is more historically accurate. The Lunar Rock Legacy, 1969, Gampaha, Western Province, Sri Lanka, and 2010, St. Louis, Missouri, USA. Everyone has moments from their childhood when they were carefree and innocent. It might have been their ecstatic delight in discovering an anthill, or the nurturing care with which a toddler regards his pansy. All families share these treasured moments from their golden years, during which they romped blithely. Dad's escapades with his brother are Pierre's household classics. In one of those tales, 6-year-old Dad was already demonstrating his legal advocacy skills by convincing his younger brother to join him in a doomed pastime. This occurred when the United States was emerging victorious in the Cold War. The world waited with bated breath as Apollo 11 landed men on the moon on July 20th, 1969. It was a historic moment for the United States and for the world, as the first humans left their mark on extraterrestrial soil. Soon after the astronauts' pioneering mission, President Nixon distributed a display of moon rocks to each of the 135 countries that had given their flag to be flown from Earth to the moon and back. My father was born in Sri Lanka, which was among the countries that received one of these displays. Dad's family resided in an old house that my great-great-grandfather built for his family in what was then a sleepy hamlet called Gumpaha. Their home was next to the railway station. The moonrock display traveled by train in Sri Lanka, and my father recalls racing towards the station with his 5-year-old brother, Alex, Mama, to see the display symbolizing momentous human achievements. Dad was ecstatic to see it. As the locomotive slowed down, the moonrock display was proudly exhibited. Dad was in a giddy mood, so he and Alex Mama practiced being astronauts. No one remembers exactly what happened, but being a boy, Dad managed to wedge a rock up one of his nostrils. A young boy who abruptly finds his sense of smell diminishing would certainly panic. However, Shantha J. Pierce, Dad, was different. He was under the impression that Acha, his mother, could fix anything. Imagine her horror when she discovered the stone was stuck. The mischievous boy was escorted to the hospital, where the doctors painstakingly extricated the gifted moon rock. Later, Alex's mama mimicked Dad's feat by wedging a rock in his ear. Needless to say, Acha was not amused. For these reasons, my family remembers the lunar landing with great fondness. 40 years later, history repeated itself when Mom urgently contacted Dad at work to address a domestic crisis. My 2-year-old brother, Avankar, had spontaneously stuck a bead up his nose. Fortunately, Dad made him sneeze it out with pepper. Despite barriers like age, maturity, and homeland, my brother eerily mimicked Dad. Regardless of the factors that would have set them apart, two significantly different people identified with each other. Even if a person immediately perceives another as different from themselves, remember we all have funny childhood stories or troubles to share. All that's required is a listening ear.
I thought it was a really interesting story on how he made himself a bike out of stuff that he just brought from thrift stores. What I decided to illustrate is the kid all proud with his new bike and happy at the accomplishment that he made, the bike, all on his own. One of the reasons I chose the story was because the kid who made his own bike had enough creativity and intelligence to assemble the bike out of parts from a thrift store. And he put the receipt in the bike stand just in case someone tried to steal it, which I thought was really clever. I felt a connection with that because I like engineering, and people say that I'm really creative, so I thought that was really cool. I hope you liked my explanation on why I chose hard work down the drain. Thank you for listening.
SOS, Saving Our Sand Dune, 1973 to 1975, Nags Head, North Carolina, USA. This is the story of how my grandma Carolista, whom I am named after, risked her life to save the largest sand dune on the East Coast. The year was 1973 in Nags Head, North Carolina. Nags Head was a small vacation town on the Outer Banks with few stores and few year-round residents. My mom, Inglis, who was 5, and her siblings were playing on a big sand dune that everyone called Jockey's Ridge, directly across from their house. It was quite normal for them to be playing on the dune, since it was across the road, but what was about to happen wouldn't be normal at all. As the kids and their babysitter headed back to the cottage, they saw a bulldozer at the foot of Jockey's Ridge, bulldozing small dunes. Worried about their sand dune, they sprinted back to the house to call their mom, Carolista, to tell her. Upset after hearing the news, Carolista quickly left her store, Carolista Jewelry Designs, picked up her kids, and scurried across the street to Jockey's Ridge. She then marched up to the bulldozer operator, and she didn't ask, but she told him to stop bulldozing the dunes. She then proceeded to stand in front of the bulldozer, which could crush her at any given moment, and refused to move. The standoff between the two seemed to last for an eternity, but was probably just a few minutes. until the operator hopped off his bulldozer, defeated, and left. After he left, Carolista pulled off the distributor cap so the bulldozer wouldn't start. Carolista called Jim Hunt, the North Carolina governor, and begged him to find funding to save Jockey's Ridge. The governor, moved by Carolista's enthusiasm and determination, obtained an injunction to stop the process of building the condominiums. The state agreed that if they got enough money, they would purchase Jockey's Ridge and preserve it as a natural landmark. Carolista then set out with the goal of making Jockey's Ridge a state park. Her thought was, this land belongs to the people because it is so unique and special. She started raising funds by selling t-shirts and bumper stickers in a booth that sat at the foot of the dune, and even selling square feet of Jockey's Ridge for $5 apiece. Between the contributions from donors and state grants, enough money was raised to purchase the property. On May 31st, 1975, Jockey's Ridge was preserved as a state park forever. It is now one of the top 3 most visited state parks in North Carolina, with over 1.3 million visitors per year. Sadly, this incredible, unstoppable woman died when my mom was only 20, which is sad for my mom, me, and everyone who got the chance to know this powerhouse of a person. I wish with all my might that I could have met her. Even though Carolista has passed, she left an amazing legacy, and of course, the sand dunes she worked so hard to save.
When making this drawing, I used pencil and then blended to show the smoothness of the sand. I drew the kids as silhouettes because no matter what gender or race, kids are kids and they just want to have fun. The drawing for SOS Saving Our Sand Dune expresses triumph and victory the kids felt when they protected their favorite sand dune. The drawing shows carefree kids whose sand dune meant the world to them. I really felt this when creating the drawing. The part from the story that inspired my drawing was how one woman's bravery preserved what is now a famous landmark.
This is the first time the Granny Annie has ever published 3 pieces of art by the same artist. So let's give her another hand for that. So the first time in 13 years, that's a pretty good record, right? In addition, it was the first artist ever to send us a stack of illustrations. The 3 that you are enjoying today are only 3 of the many beautiful illustrations she sent us. We just they're just beautiful. I recognize they're great. And since this is the cover art, we wanted to present you with this laminated poster that has your art on it, and hope you will enjoy it and give it to you with our best wishes for a very bright career with your talent. All right.
My Mom and the Monkey, 1975, Angoda, Central Province, Sri Lanka. My mother grew up in a convent located in Sri Lanka, which is a small tropical island off the southeast coast of India. The culture and customs were different from those in America. Monkeys were common pets like cats and dogs. At the time, my mother went by the name Nishanti. She was a curious and naughty child. Her older sister, Vasanti, was the complete opposite. She was a shy and timid girl. Vasanti always tried to keep her younger sister out of trouble. They lived in Sri Lanka until 1980, and this story took place in the mid-1970s. The 2 sisters lived in a convent because they had been abandoned by their parents. There was a kind family who had been a neighbor of their parents, who often had the sisters over on school breaks. One day, Nishanti and Vasanti were invited to the family's house for lunch. When playing in the backyard, Nishanti noticed they had a pet monkey. Their monkey was tied to a chain. I wonder what would happen if I poked the monkey with a stick, said Nishanti. Nishanti, don't poke the monkey, said Vasanti. Unfortunately, Nishanti decided to poke the monkey. Vasanti hid in the house out of fear. Nishanti shoved the monkey many times, and it started to get annoyed. The monkey broke from its chain in anger and chased Nishanti into the house. The monkey ended up devouring all of their lunch and wrecked the family's kitchen. Vasanti cried because she knew Nishanti was going to be in a great deal of trouble. All the adults were outraged at the monkey. However, Vasanti told them what Nishanti had done because she was fearful and did not like to lie. The adults were furious at Nishanti, and she got severely punished. We can all learn many lessons from this story. The most significant is that we should think before we act. This is always crucial to remember because when we think, we can stop ourselves from making mistakes. When my mom didn't think, she ended up getting chased by a monkey and getting into much trouble. Even though the same thing would probably not happen in America, the story can still demonstrate many lessons that we can apply to our own lives.
How a Bull Taught Me to Shave. 1980, Calamine, Arkansas, USA. As a boy growing up in Arkansas, my Papa Sawyer spent a lot of time with his Mama and Papa Milligan at the old home place. So on a vacation, he wanted my grandma to see the old home place he talked about so much. They left my mom as a baby with her great uncle so they could hike out to see the now falling down house on the other side of a field. As they were walking towards the place where my great-great-grandparents once lived, they were talking about Papa's memories of the old place. When they heard a sniff, a grunt, and they looked up and they saw a big black bull coming towards them. They had known there was a bull, but they had never hoped to see it. The bull was coming towards them. They had to race to the crumbling shelter. They hoped the bull would forget them if they disappeared from sight. Outside, a storm came quick. Luckily, the bull wandered away to look for a dry spot. As my Papa stood under the leaning roof to wait out the rain, he told my grandma that his Papa used to shave on the front porch. As a boy, my Papa would get water from the cistern in a cup. Then he was allowed to use the horsehair brush to lather the soap. He acted out these steps as he remembered seeing his Papa do it. He would stand right here. He showed my grandma. He would reach up over his head and pull the shave kit from the rafters. And then my Papa did the very same thing. 17 years after his grandpa had died, from the porch of the coming house, he held in his hands his Papa Milligan shave kit. My grandparents still have Papa Milligan's shave kit from the old home, and they both think that it was left there for my Papa to find. When I spend the night at my Papa's house, he lets me sit up on the bathroom counter, he puts shave cream on his face, and I get to help him shave. I'm glad that big black bull was there to chase my grandma and Papa into the house, so my Papa could think of watching his Papa shaving. I'm pretty sure that bull is why I know how to shave today.
The Tornado, 1980, Hazelwood, Missouri, USA. Everybody knows how you're supposed to go inside and stay in a safe place during a tornado. There was one time when my uncle Andy didn't, and he learned his lesson when a tornado came. My mom's, Christy's, parents were out for their anniversary. Helen and Andy, my mom's teenage brother and sister and brother, were outside hanging out with their friends in the yard. Then my mom heard on TV that there was a tornado coming. She put her little brother, Scott, to bed in the basement, then went outside to tell Helen, Andy, and their friends to come inside because the tornado was coming. When she told them to come inside, they called her a goody two-shoes. She tried to get them to listen, but it was futile. The wind started to blow and howl like crazy. That's when Helen's friend, and Andy's friends decided to go in. Andy decided to stay outside. When Helen and Andy opened the front door, it ripped off its hinges and flew off, spinning like a piece of paper in the wind. Andy thought the stick fort he and his friends made would protect him. Then, all of a sudden, the black, swirling, howling whirlwind picked up the stick fort with Andy in it and slammed it back down to the ground. Andy ran to the jungle gym and held on for dear life. The wind from the monstrous tornado blew Andy around like a flag in a tornado. Even with the intense winds blowing him around, he still held on. Finally, Andy was able to get on the ground and run inside, even with the strong winds. After he got inside, he went down to the basement. My mom, Helen, and their friends were so glad to see Andy in safety with no severe injuries. Until the tornado was gone, they didn't leave the basement. Meanwhile, the tornado continued to cause destruction outside. It smashed up the shed in the yard and scattered the pieces everywhere. A while later, the tornado stopped, but it left a mess. The good news was that the house was fine. When my mom's parents got home, they found the front door ripped off. They didn't know there had been a tornado because it didn't strike where they were. They found pieces of the shed a few blocks away. From that experience, Andy learned the lesson that you should always go inside during a tornado.
The No Good, Terrible, Very Bad Day, 1981, Deerfield, Michigan, USA. When my mom was in kindergarten, she rode the bus home every day. When my mom was younger, she was really, really shy. Her house was the farthest away from the school, and our normal bus driver was really nice. But one day, the normal bus driver was sick, and there was a substitute bus driver. One by one, all the kids got dropped off the bus, including my mom's best friend, Heather. Then, my mom started to worry. When the substitute bus driver got to my mom's house, she just drove by. Vroom! The bus went straight past her house. It didn't slow down, not even a bit. My mom was petrified. She kept as quiet as possible and huddled in the corner of her seat. The bus driver drove back to school, got off the bus, and came back with a broom to clean the bus. Swish, swash, side to side the broom went. The bus driver looked from seat to seat, checking for trash. When the bus driver got to the very last seat, she saw a little kindergartner huddled in the corner of her seat. And just like any bus driver should when they see a kid on the bus, she screamed. Then my mom uncurled herself and started screaming too. The bus driver calmed herself and asked my mom in a strict voice, "Why are you still on the bus, little missy?" My mom said squeakily, "You passed my house." The bus driver was startled, so she took my mom to the school office and called the secretary and told the secretary, "This girl got left on the school bus. Can we call her mom?" So they called my mom's mom, but she didn't hear the phone because she was outside waiting for the bus, and the phone was inside. The secretary called one more time, and my mom's mom still didn't pick up. My mom was trying so hard not to cry. Nobody wants to cry in front of an adult, unless it's their parents. Just then, the janitor, Mr. Mueller, came into the office.
The janitor's kid was in the same class as my mom's. He boldly said, "Let's call your mom one more time, and if she doesn't pick up, then I will take you home in my truck." They called my grandma one more time, and sadly, she didn't pick up. My mom tentatively went home in the janitor's truck. When my mom finally got home, she ran to her mom, told her what had happened, and burst into tears. Mr. Mueller and my grandma exchanged their thank yous, and the janitor departed. After my mom stopped crying, her mom said, "You should write a story about this event while I cook you some chicken and stars soup." My mom did, and she drew a school bus on the front of the book and titled it, "The No Good, Terrible, Very Bad Day." My mom still has that book to remind her that writing stories always makes her feel better, and I have her book with me today.
I chose to draw an illustration for the Candy Thieves story because I instantly visualized a picture after I read the story. I couldn't reference this from the internet, so to get a perspective of what I saw in my head, I had my mom take a picture of my hand putting something into my back pocket. With the help of the photo, I began to sketch my art. The reason this idea appealed to me was because it represents the turning point and suspense in the story. As soon as the boy takes the candy bar, the reader knows that his one wrong choice will change everything. I thought it would be good to draw that moment.
Oh my goodness, what an afternoon. Let's give these students another round of applause, all of you. I just can't tell you how much I look forward to this each year. After reading so many Granny Annie stories for months, and then getting to actually meet the authors and hear the stories in their own voices and meet the artists and hear what they have to say about their process and their experience. It's just terrific. Please bear with me for just a few minutes, and then we're going to have the students leave the room first so that they can go get the group picture taken. But I just have a few things to say. First of all, thank you from my heart to each one of you who came here today. These students are doing such important work, and I just love that you all are supporting them in that so much. Their creative work, their insights into what these experiences mean for themselves and for all of us. So thank you for supporting them in this way. Also, if this experience today has touched you, I hope you'll consider making a financial donation to the Granny Annie. As I said earlier, we're a nonprofit or volunteer organization, so any donation is not only tax deductible, it helps us produce this book each year and this experience each year for all the students who take part. So thank you for thinking of that. We've taken a lot of photos here today, and we'll continue to take some more photos. We will be sorting through them and hope to have them on the Granny Annie's Facebook page in about a week. We also have a video recording that's being made today, and that will be posted on YouTube. That'll take a little longer. It'll take maybe three or 4 weeks, something like that. It's going to be edited in order to maintain the privacy of the students, so that takes a little bit of time. But you won't see the whole program, but you will see each student doing their part. And you can keep track of both of those by watching the homepage of the Granny Annie's website, and there will be a note there letting you know when those are both ready. So we invite you all to stay a little bit longer and enjoy the book signing and the reception. It's going to be held in the AT&T room, which is just down the hall from here. And the authors and artists will be there, and the Storykeeper will be there to meet all of you. I hope you'll take a few minutes to let them know how much you appreciated their work, and maybe ask them some questions about their experience or any comments that have come to your mind as you listen to their stories or listen to them talk about their art. Let's clap them out. All right, thanks again, everybody.